Hi, and welcome back to Platonic Soul. I hope you've been well. If you've watched the last couple episodes of this series, you'll know I've been discussing the last 5 speeches of that great manifesto on Platonic love, Plato's Symposium. I've talked about how, on the one hand, these first 5 speakers seem to make some pretty remarkable claims for eros, especially Agathon, the last to speak. He basically calls it the highest good. But I've also noted that there seems an element of humor here in these speeches. Agathon, in fact, says his speech was meant to be taken partly seriously, partly just in fun. And I've said I think the reason for this is that while on the one hand they find something intoxicating about praising eros so highly, they're also aware they'd have no way of defending the wild claims they make for it if someone were to question them. And they know, after all, they're in the presence of a master questioner. We now move to the most important part of the dialogue, the speech of that questioner, Socrates, which includes within it the speech of the prophetess Diotima, and thus takes up a pretty big chunk of the entire work. It's through this speech, and this speech within a speech, that Plato will give us the core of that teaching on human love and desire that he's famous for. Even though his actual teaching, as we'll see, goes quite a bit deeper and has much more life-transforming potential than what it passes for today. I mean, this idea that to practice Platonic love means simply avoiding sexual relationships. That will all come later in this series. Right now I want to focus on the first thing Socrates does in his speech. That is basically to demolish Agathon's argument that eros is the highest good. I suspect you'll find his argument, if you're not already familiar with it, a bit surprising. Not the point that he makes exactly, but how he goes about making it. The argument that he makes in support of it. The first thing that Socrates does, actually, is to give us a display of that famous irony of his. One thing that makes this interesting is that it's not really irony as we understand it today. Aironeia comes from Aaron, which means a dissembler, specifically one who doesn't let on everything he knows or how clever he is. And the Aaron was a stock character in ancient Greek comedy, along with its opposite, the alazon, or braggart. Aristophanes, one of the guests at this drinking party, wrote these stock characters into his plays, actually. In the dialogues of Plato, Socrates uses this technique of aironeia, of pretending to know less than he does, to often ruthless effect as a way of drawing people's opinions out so he can demolish their arguments all the better. Sometimes this subtle ruthlessness of his goes to the extreme that he actually draws out those he's questioning, even to the point of demolishing their own arguments without realizing it, even to the point where they're demolishing their own arguments without realizing it. Socrates isn't so ruthless at this gathering of friends, but when Agathon winds up his speech, you might remember his speech basically builds to this wondrous climax that includes a long series of the blessings brought by Eros, quote, the fairest and best guide, unquote, whom Agathon describes at one point as a savior. When Agathon winds up and it's his turn to talk, Socrates pretends to be greatly impressed by what he's just heard. Am I and anyone else whatsoever not to be at a loss after so fair and varied a speech has been made? Though the rest was not quite so marvelous, that bit at the end, who would not be thunderstruck on hearing the beauty of its words and phrases? I, for my part, on reflecting that I myself should be unable to say anything nearly as beautiful, almost ran off and was gone in shame. And note that he speaks only to the beauty of the speech, not to its truth. Anyway, then he pretends both to have misrepresented himself as knowledgeable in eros. You might remember that soon after the beginning of the dialogue, he claims to know about nothing but ta erotica, and to have not been smart enough to understand the premise of the evening's competition. He says, I am to be laughed at for having agreed to eulogize eros in turn with you, and for claiming that I was skilled in erotics. For, as it has turned out, I know nothing of the matter, nor how one is to eulogize anything. For in my stupidity, I believed the truth had to be told about anything that was given a eulogy, and that this was the underpinning, and that by selecting the most beautiful parts of the truth, one was to arrange them in the seemliest manner possible. And I was quite filled with the proud thought that I would speak well, since I knew the truth about praising anything. But it was not this, after all, it seems, that was meant by the fair praising of anything, but the attribution to the matter at hand of the greatest and fairest things possible, regardless of whether this was so or not. So he's pretending to not understand praise here, because the others, he says, have all praised eros in an exaggerated way. He's pretending to conclude that that's what praise is, and that they all understand what praise is, and he's the only one who doesn't, because his assumption was that praise must be truthful. So he claims to have, therefore, no hope at winning this competition, and he offers first to walk away with his marbles if they don't let him praise eros in the way he understands praise, and then to continue on with praise as he understands it, only if his speech isn't compared with theirs. He says, "Let me then call it quits. I am not a eulogist in this fashion. I'm simply incapable of it. Not that I am unwilling. On the contrary, I am willing, if you want, to tell the truth on my own terms, so long as my words are not to be compared with your speeches, lest I be laughed at." They agree, and then he asks, "Allow me further, Phaedrus, to ask Agathon about a few small points, in order that when I have got him to agree with me, I can go ahead and speak. We, the readers, know better. We suspect that these little points Socrates is about to question Agathon on are anything but small, and that the speech he ends up giving will be anything but laughable. So the character of Socrates is established here as really quite tricky for anyone who isn't already familiar with it. He's a bit of a slippery fellow, and that fits because the direction he's about to take things is, I think, kind of unpredictable. What he's about to do is to make Agathon admit that eros is not the highest good, which I don't think is that unpredictable in itself. I think humans generally, although we might admit that eros is one of the best things in life, would tend to balk at agreeing that it's the very best thing. My guess would be that most would say that happiness is what most of us live for, and that eros seems to involve only a certain kind of happiness. I'd say most people today, apart from maybe some mystics who would see union with absolute reality as being the highest good, most people would see happiness as lying in the attainment of a whole range of things. I think the relative importance of these things would vary from person to person, but I think that most people would include in this range of things love/relationships, but not only erotic ones, satisfying work, wealth, and health, among other things. For the Homeric heroes the Greeks were raised on, fame that outlasted their own lives was perhaps the highest good. You may remember several episodes ago René Descartes singling out health. He called health the chief good in life. And we have to be a bit astonished at Descartes here again as voicing the spirit of the coming age, because health, including both physical and mental health insofar as they can be separated, is, I think, probably the only way that well-being can be measured objectively, and so perhaps the only measure of happiness that our secular society today can really accept. Anyway, all that to say, it's not hard to imagine Agathon's argument that eros is the highest good being attacked from many different angles. There are so many other rival claimants. And actually, the most obvious of these would seem to come from Socrates himself. Because as you may know, Socrates in the Republic puts forth this idea of knowledge of the good, knowledge of goodness itself as the highest good for humankind, the highest happiness. So this is the direction we might expect Socrates to take the conversation in right now. But in fact, this isn't where he actually takes it. He starts by interrogating Agathon about what eros is after, and eventually gets him to admit that eros seeks beauty. But if something seeks something else, Socrates says, it must not already have it. Things seek that which they don't already possess. And so eros, contrary to what Agathon claimed, must not possess beauty itself. It must not be beautiful, at which point Agathon admits to slightly sad effect, "It's probable, Socrates, that I knew nothing of what I had said." Then Socrates gets Agathon to admit that good things are also beautiful. And so, concludes Socrates, if eros is in need of beautiful things, and the good things are beautiful, it would be in need of the good things as well. Eros must lack good things if it seeks them, and it can hardly be the highest good if it lacks goodness. At this point, then, it may seem as though Socrates may be about to divest Agathon and the others of a sad false hope they've put in eros. But in fact, he's about to do nothing of the sort. In fact, what he has just got Agathon to admit to is only the first step in the elaboration of a theory of eros that will hold this massive transformative potential I've been talking about, and massive hope to humankind. I'll talk about that in the next few episodes. In the meantime, thanks for watching, and hope to see you then.